Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to get into this one.
Yeah, me too. So I want you, the listener, to imagine you wake up tomorrow morning and your job, your bank account, your social status, and like even your very name have been just completely, permanently erased.
Right, just gone overnight.
Exactly. You have absolutely no legal standing, no authority, no title. Who is the person actually left standing in that room?
It's terrifying to even think about, honestly.
Right. Well, today we are taking a deep dive into a historical figure who lived that exact nightmare, dramatized by William Shakespeare in the life and death of King Richard II.
Such a powerful text.
Mm-hmm.
And we're pairing it with the commentary of the 19th century essayist William Hazlitt, who is just razor sharp on this.
Oh, Hazlitt does not hold back. We're basically stripping away the medieval armor and the castles to get at this timeless psychological terror. Like, what happens to the human mind when an identity built entirely on external power just shatters?
Yeah, and the contrast Shakespeare creates here is, well, it's a masterclass in human psychology. You basically have two completely opposed ways of existing in the world.
Right, Richard versus Bowling Brook.
Exactly. On one side, you have King Richard. He represents this deeply poetic sensibility. He's someone who relies entirely on the aesthetic of power, the inertia of tradition.
Just coasting on the vibe of being king.
Coasting on the vibe, yeah. And on the other side is his cousin and rival, Henry Bowling Brook. He operates with this ruthless, calculated, and honestly incredibly modern political pragmatism.
Which is where Hazlitt comes in, right?
Yes. Hazlitt's commentary is essential because he just slices right through the romanticism of the era. He exposes the raw machinery of how power actually changes hands and how the loss of that power completely unravels a person's sense of self.
Well, let's dive straight into that unraveling, because the core wisdom of this text really centers on that ultimate collapse of the self.
It really does. Shakespeare gives us a terrifying portrait of what happens when someone realizes that their external power was always just an illusion.
And the climax of this realization is in Act 4, right? During the famous deposition scene.
Oh, it's brutal. Richard doesn't just hand the crown over to Bolingbroke. He physically and metaphorically dismantles his own existence in real time.
Yeah, it's like this agonizing ritual of unmaking.
That's a great way to put it. He's forced to publicly surrender his title, but the language he uses, it reveals this profound internal devastation. He says, with mine own tears I wash away my balm, with mine own tongue deny my sacred state.
Okay, wait, that's the holy oil, right?
Yes, exactly. The consecrated holy oil used to anoint a king during his coronation. And in the medieval mindset, this wasn't just a symbol. It was an indelible mark of divine favor.
Like it physically changed your DNA or something?
Right, fundamentally altered your state of being. So for Richard to say he is washing away the holy oil with his own tears, he's admitting to a complete metaphysical collapse.
He's declaring an ego death.
Completely. He continues saying, with mine own hands I give away my crown. With my own breath release all duteous oaths.
He's going through the architecture of his entire identity, just pulling out every single load-bearing pillar until the whole structure collapses on top of him.
And that internal collapse requires an external visual, which leads to a moment of just pure psychological theater. The mirror scene.
Oh man, the mirror scene is so intense.
It is. Richard is so disoriented by this loss of title that he asks for a looking glass. He desperately needs to see his own face now that it is, as he says, bankrupt of his majesty.
He's like searching the glass for some physical deformity, right?
Right.
Or sudden aging to match the absolute devastation he feels inside.
Yeah, he stares into the reflection and asks, was this face the face that every day under his household roof they'd keep 10,000 men?
And the tragedy is that the face hasn't changed at all. The flesh is exactly the same.
Exactly. He realizes right then and there that the glory he thought was woven into his physical biology was just a mass hallucination. The power was never actually in him.
So he just snaps. He hurls the mirror against the ground, shattering it, and says, for there it is, cracked in 100 shivers.
That shattered mirror is the ultimate visual representation of a fragmented identity. And, Hazlitt makes this phenomenal observation about the mechanics of this scene.
What does he say?
He notes, the steps by which Bolingbroke mounts the throne are those by which Richard sinks into the grave.
Wow, an inverse relationship.
Perfect inverse. As Richard is systematically stripped of his external titles, he's forced into a deepening, agonizing realization of his own mere humanity. He has never had to be just a human being before.
And we actually see the beginning of that realization a bit earlier in the play, right? When his grip on the kingdom is just starting to slip.
Yeah, he drops all the royal pretense and begs his followers to see the reality of his condition.
He tells them, throw away respect, tradition, form, and ceremonious duty. I live with bread like you, feel want, taste grief, need friends.
It's a stunning admission for a medieval king. He is realizing that underneath the heavy crown and the velvet robes, he's just a vulnerable biological organism.
He needs a meal, and he feels lonely.
Exactly. But that sudden exposure to his own vulnerability, it's just too much for his mind to process. Hazlitt points out that Richard's sensibility has always been entirely absorbed in his own person and his own grandeur.
He's never built up the psychological fortitude to actually navigate misfortune.
No, not at all. So when reality pierces the bubble, his instinct isn't to fight back. His instinct is a desperate desire to simply cease to exist entirely.
Which gives us that haunting line where he cries out, "Oh, that I were a mockery king of snow, standing before the son of Bowling Brook to melt myself away in water drops."
He literally wants the earth to swallow him. If he cannot be the king, he does not know how to occupy space in the universe.
The shadow of his sorrow, as Bolingbroke coldly points out to him, has destroyed the shadow of his face. His grief just consumes his identity.
Yeah.
You know, if we pull this into a modern context, isn't this the exact psychology of a high-profile founder whose entire self-worth is tethered to the title of CEO?
Oh, 100%. Their identity is the company. They are the visionary.
Right. And then the board of directors orchestrates a coup, or the market turns, and they are ousted. And walking out of corporate headquarters with the cardboard docks, it isn't just a career setback for them, it's a profound existential crisis.
They aren't merely grieving the loss of a salary. They're terrified because without the title, they have absolutely no idea who the person in the mirror is.
Exactly. It's ego death.
The parallel is incredibly accurate. But to fully grasp why that ego death is so catastrophic for Richard, we have to examine the historical operating system of the 14th century.
Right, the divine right of kings.
Yes. And how a pragmatist like Bolingbroke manages to hack a system that everyone else believed was divinely ordained.
Well, Richard's absolute certainty in his own invulnerability is staggering. He genuinely believes his authority is an unalterable cosmic fact.
He really does. When he first learns that Bolingbroke has returned from exile and is marching an army across England, Richard is, well, he's practically serene.
He delivers this sweeping statement, not all the water in the rough, rude sea can wash the balm off from an anointed king.
He takes it even further into the supernatural, too.
Yeah.
He confidently declares that for every man Bolingbroke has enlisted in his rebellion, God has in heavenly pay a glorious angel waiting to fight for the king.
He's literally relying on angels as his military strategy.
Yes, because he doesn't view his power as a political reality that requires maintenance or alliances or strategy. He views it as a biological and spiritual inheritance, guaranteed by the architecture of the universe.
It's an ontological assumption. Like, he believes the crown operates like gravity. You don't have to campaign for gravity. It just exists.
But Hazlitt completely punctures this romantic view of the era. He introduces this concept he calls the accomplished barbarism of the time.
Accomplished barbarism. I love that phrase.
It perfectly captures the cognitive dissonance of the period. Because Hazlitt argues that underneath the chivalric poetry and the heraldry and the heavy armor, this was a society where political disputes were ultimately settled by sheer brute force.
And we see that violent reality vividly in the first act, right? With the aborted trial by combat between Bolingbroke and Thomas Gilbert.
Absolutely. The gauge-throwing scenes are incredibly revealing.
Yeah, it's wild. You have these immensely powerful nobles basically throwing their heavy armored gloves, their gauges, onto the floor of the court, screaming accusations of treason at each other.
And later in the play, the breakdown of order becomes almost comical in its intensity. You have Aumerle, Fitzwater, Surrey, Percy. They're all practically tripping over each other, hurling their gauges onto the floor in front of Bolingbroke.
Right. They're like, there I throw my gauge. I task the earth to the, like, there is my bond of fate. It's just a room full of heavily armed men ready to slaughter each other over rumors.
Hazlitt's analysis of these nobles is beautifully cynical. He observes that there is neither truth nor honor in all these noble persons.
Yeah.
They answer words with words and blows with blows purely in self-defense. Their defining principle isn't divine justice. It is merely the courage to violently maintain whatever wrong they dare commit.
Wow, that is the true political reality of Richard's world. And he is entirely blind to it.
completely blind. But Bolingbroke sees the board clearly. If Richard believes his authority descends downward from heaven, Bolingbroke realizes that sustainable power must be built upward from the common people.
And Richard himself actually gives us a masterclass description of Bolingbroke's political strategy right before exiling him.
Yes, he disgustedly observes how Bolingbroke courts the commoners.
He complains, "Off goes his bonnet to an oyster wench. A brace of draymen bid God speed him well."
Hazlitt describes Bolingbroke's methodology perfectly, calling him crafty and noting that he is building power on opinion and cementing opinion by power.
While Richard relies on an abstract cosmic order, Bolingbroke is running a grassroots public relations campaign.
Exactly. He is doing the slow, unglamorous, highly calculated work of building political capital on the ground.
So it feels like Richard is running on outdated software. He thinks God is his cybersecurity, but Bolingbroke realizes power actually comes from the users, the common people. Does Richard fall because he's a bad person, or just because he completely misunderstands the mechanics of power in his own era?
I think it's a mix of both, but primarily the latter. He is a terrible manager of his realm. To bridge the gap into the 21st century, we need to examine the character of John of Gaunt.
Right, Richard's uncle and Bolingbroke's father.
Yes, and he delivers what is arguably one of the most famous patriotic speeches in the English language right before he dies. But the context of that speech is often completely misunderstood.
Everyone knows the beginning of it. He's on his deathbed delivering this sweeping praise of England, this royal throne of kings, this sceptered isle, this precious stone set in the silver sea, this blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this England.
It sounds like pure nationalist poetry, but it is actually a devastating setup. He elevates the inherent value of the nation only to emphasize the tragedy of how Richard is currently managing it.
Right. He pivots immediately from that soaring praise to a furious critique of Richard's fiscal and political leadership.
Yes, he states that this incredible land is now leased out. I die pronouncing it. Like to a tenement or pelting farm.
Pelting farm.
Yeah, which translates to a paltry, insignificant, poorly managed piece of real estate. Gaunt is essentially accusing the king of acting like a slumlord.
Because Richard desperately needs capital to fund his disastrous wars in Ireland and to maintain the lavish lifestyle of his court. He's selling off the country's future for a quick infusion of cash.
And the moment Gaunt dies, Richard proves the point by immediately seizing all of Gaunt's plate, coin, and ancestral revenues to fund the Irish expedition.
Completely bypassing the legal rights of Gaunt's exiled son, Bolingbroke.
It is the medieval equivalent of disastrous corporate short-termism.
Oh, totally. Think of a CEO who is brought into a legacy company with incredible brand value. Instead of investing in that legacy, the CEO slashes the research and development budget, sells off the most valuable patents to competitors, and lays off half the workforce, all just to make the quarterly profits look momentarily spectacular.
Exactly. They secure a massive bonus for themselves, but they have completely hollowed out the institutional health of the organization. Gaunt sees Richard doing exactly this to England.
And Gaunt warns his nephew about the dangerous echo chamber he has constructed. He hopes his deathbed counsel might undeaf his ear.
But his brother, the Duke of York, sadly points out that Richard's mind is impenetrable. York notes that the king is entirely surrounded by flattering sounds.
Yeah.
He listens only to lascivious meters and obsessively follows superficial fashions imported from Italy.
Gaunt tells Richard bluntly, 1,000 flatterers sit within thy crown.
That echo chamber phenomenon is universally recognizable in modern leadership. When leaders surround themselves exclusively with people who validate their brilliance and hide the bad news, they become trapped in their own hype.
And the tragedy is how the leader behaves when reality finally breaches the walls of that echo chamber. When Richard returns from Ireland and hears Bolingbroke has amassed a massive army, his psychological state just fractures.
He swings wildly between extremes of grandiosity and despair. It is a mesmerizing psychological oscillation. One moment, he is the arrogant, untouchable king, threatening divine retribution. The very next moment, upon hearing that more allies have defected, he collapses into absolute defeatism.
Instead of strategizing or mobilizing his loyalists or trying to negotiate, the actions a pragmatist would take, he substitutes action with poetic rumination.
Yes. He sits down and says, "For God's sake, let us sit upon the ground," and tell sad stories of the death of kings.
He immediately starts romanticizing his own inevitable failure. He lists out how previous kings met their ends, some deposed, some slain in war, some haunted, some poisoned. He's writing the script of his own tragedy in real time.
Casting himself as the beautiful, doomed protagonist.
Yeah.
And, we might judge Richard harshly for this, but if we're honest, that sit on the ground and tell sad stories, instinct is deeply ingrained in human nature.
Oh, absolutely. We all have a bit of that instinct. When a project fails or a relationship ends, it's so much easier to perform the tragedy of our failure than to actually fix the problem. Are we all just guilty of making woe wanton?
I think we are. Consider how we react to failure. We want to draft the perfect melancholic social media post or give a beautiful poetic monologue to our friends about how the universe is fundamentally arrayed against us.
We prefer the aesthetic of victimhood to the harsh reality of accountability.
Richard actually names this behavior later when he says, "We make woe wanton with this fond delay. We indulge in our suffering." Because if our defeat is an epic, unavoidable tragedy orchestrated by a cruel fate, then we don't have to look at how our own mismanagement caused the collapse.
Right. So if Richard serves as a profound warning of what not to do when facing adversity, how do the other characters suggest we handle loss and unexpected exile?
Well, John of Gaunt offers an explicit strategy when his son, Bolingbroke, is initially banished by Richard for 6 years. Gaunt attempts to teach his son the art of cognitive reframing.
He tells him to completely flip the narrative in his own mind, right? To take psychological control.
Yes. He instructs him, "Think not the king did banish thee, but thou the king." Gaunt is arguing for the supreme power of the human mind to dictate its own reality.
He tells Bolingbroke to reimagine the harsh exile as a deliberate vacation. Call it a travel that thou takes for pleasure.
He even suggests that Bolingbroke should imagine the grass he walks on in foreign lands is strewn with flowers specifically for his presence, and that the birds are musicians playing exclusively for him.
Gaunt asserts, "For gnarling sorrow hath less power to bite the man that mocks at it and sets it light." Okay, but reading that passage, my modern brain immediately throws up a red flag.
Why is that?
It sounds suspiciously like medieval toxic positivity. You can't just manifest away a 10-year banishment by pretending the birds are your personal band. And Bolingbroke actually aggressively rejects his father's advice, right?
He does. Bolingbroke is grounded in cold reality, and he offers an incredibly sharp retort. He says, "Oh, who can hold a fire in his hand by thinking on the frosty Caucasus? Or cloy the hungry edge of appetite by bare imagination of a feast?"
I mean, it's brilliant. Is Gaunt just feeding his son toxic positivity? Because Bolingbroke is basically saying that artificial apprehension of a good thing only makes you feel the agonizing reality of the bad thing more acutely. Pretending you're at a feast when you're starving only makes the hunger sharper.
Bolingbroke's counterargument is incredibly astute.
So it raises a vital question for anyone trying to navigate a crisis. How do we balance reframing our reality without slipping into the same pure delusion that ultimately destroyed Richard?
The answer lies not in Gaunt's poetic advice, but in Bolingbroke's actual behavior throughout his exile and return. Hazlitt provides the key insight here, noting that Bolingbroke is perpetually patient for occasion. He is hyper-observant.
So the practice isn't cognitive delusion.
Exactly. It is supreme emotional regulation in the face of intense provocation. Even when Bolingbroke returns to England, which is technically an act of treason, he never loses his composure.
He doesn't land on the beach and immediately declare he's there to steal the crown.
Precisely. He maintains a facade of absolute legal restraint. He claims he has only returned to claim his rightful inheritance, the Lancaster lands. He inches his way toward the throne by what Hazlitt calls regular but slow degrees.
He controls the narrative patiently, methodically managing his reactions until he has the ultimate advantage securely within his reach.
And that level of strategic patience requires an ironclad sense of self. Which brings us to a terrifying reflection point for you, the listener. Let's call it the mirror test.
The mirror test, I like that.
Drawn directly from Richard's collapse. Ask yourself this: if your primary title, your wealth, your career, or your defining relationship were abruptly taken away tomorrow, what is the substance left behind the shadow of your face?
If you were forced to smash the mirror of your external identity, what internal architecture is actually left standing?
Most of us would actively resist taking that mirror test. And that resistance points directly to the obstacles to growth embedded in this text.
Shakespeare really forces us to confront uncomfortable realities about human nature here. Specifically, our attraction to the seductive trap of self-pity and our deep discomfort with the ugly, uncompromising utility of ambition.
Hazlitt zeroes in on this when he analyzes why audiences throughout history have reacted so sympathetically to Richard in the later acts. Hazlitt points out a glaring moral contradiction. He writes, "We feel neither respect nor love for the deposed monarch, for he is as wanting in energy as in principle. But we pity him, for he pities himself."
Wow. We pity him, for he pities himself. That is a devastating indictment of human psychology.
We are entirely seduced by his poetic suffering. Hazlitt notes that Richard's heart bleeds afresh at every new stroke of mischance, and he articulates that bleeding with such beautiful language that we forget the history.
We forget that his own ruthless misconduct, his illegal seizure of private property, the disastrous mismanagement of the state, those are the exact factors that provoked the crisis.
Our own growth is often stunted because we are naturally drawn to the aesthetic of suffering over the difficult, unglamorous work of accountability. We love a beautifully articulated victim narrative.
And if we flip that around, we see another massive obstacle. Modern audiences desperately want the good guy to win through pure righteousness. We want nice guys to finish first.
But Bolingbroke is not pure of heart. He wins through cold, calculating pragmatism. He leverages every relationship, calculates every smile, and maneuvers his enemies into corners.
So does this play essentially teach us that merit and poetry are useless, and that the person who treats life like a giant chessboard is always going to win? Are we uncomfortable with Bolingbroke because he proves that nice, poetic guys finish last?
I think we are deeply uncomfortable with the fact that the skills required to gain and execute power are often inherently morally compromising. Bolingbroke demonstrates that in the brutal arena of reality, the dispassionate chess player will almost always defeat the person relying on poetry.
There's another profound obstacle to growth hidden in the margins here, too, specifically regarding the psychological toll of being forced out of your established position.
Were you thinking of Thomas Mowbray?
Yes. When Richard abruptly banishes Mowbray for life, Mowbray delivers this heartbreaking lament, not about losing his wealth, but about losing his language.
He says, "The language I have learned these 40 years, my native English, now I must forego." He describes his tongue as being like an unstringed viol or a harp.
Mowbray is articulating the paralyzing disorientation of losing one's cultural and social context. He's thrust into a world where the tools he spent a lifetime mastering are suddenly useless.
If you map that onto modern life, it's incredibly relevant.
Right. When someone is forced to change careers at 40, or their industry is rendered obsolete by AI, or they move to a completely new culture, they experience this exact loss.
Their native skills don't translate. They don't speak the jargon of the new industry. They feel exactly like an unstringed harp. That loss of context is a massive psychological hurdle to overcome.
And navigating all these harsh realities requires a really high degree of discernment. If we accept that Bolingbroke is a master of the chessboard and acknowledge that losing our context is terrifying, we must still step back and evaluate the moral cost.
We cannot simply extract the pragmatism without examining the ethics. We have to separate the text's enduring psychological truths from its medieval political baggage.
Exactly. We can't just walk away from this deep dive concluding, hey, be a ruthless, calculating manipulator like Bolingbroke and everything will work out fine.
No. We must apply rigorous discernment. For instance, we have to distinguish between Richard's genuine human sorrow in the later acts and his toxic entitlement in the early acts.
While his suffering in prison is profoundly moving, we can't forget the fierce warning delivered by his uncle, the Duke of York.
Yes. When Richard announces his plan to illegally seize Gaunt's lands, York desperately tries to stop him. York points out that stealing the inheritance violates the very laws of sequence and succession that legitimize Richard's own crown.
York asks him directly, "How art thou a king, but by fair sequence and succession?"
York's argument is brilliant and entirely applicable to modern governance. He's telling the king, if you break the foundational rules of property to steal Bolingbroke's money today, you are destroying the exact same legal framework that protects your right to sit on the throne tomorrow.
You cannot arbitrarily suspend the rules for your own benefit without fundamentally undermining the system that gives you power.
Discerning readers must recognize that Richard's downfall isn't a tragic accident of fate. It's the direct, logical result of his own breach of the social contract.
And Hazlitt offers a pretty cynical but necessary perspective on the nobility of Shakespeare's era here, too.
He argues against romanticizing these historical figures. He claims they operate just like the refined politicians of his own 19th century, referring every decision to convenience, fashion, and good breeding. rather than any allegiance to abstract truth or justice.
Hazlitt is warning us not to be fooled by the shiny armor and the grand speeches about honor. Underneath the pageantry, they are driven by self-interest, protecting their assets and status, just like executives and politicians do today.
We also have to address the play's inherent romanticization of the Lord's anointed. The play was written during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, when questioning the divine right of a monarch was practically unthinkable.
Right. The text implies a cosmic horror at the prospect of deposing a rightful king. The Bishop of Carlisle delivers that terrifying prophecy, warning that the blood of English shall manure the ground.
And historically, the devastating Wars of the Roses did follow this usurpation. However, a modern listener must discern that while political instability is horrific, the text's inherent monarchical bias, the idea that a tyrannical ruler must be endured endlessly, is an idea we have fundamentally rejected.
So the task of discernment is to separate the beautiful poetry from the terrible governance. We face this challenge constantly in the modern information age.
Absolutely.
Just because someone gives a stunning, tear-jerking, beautifully produced apology on a podcast or social media today doesn't change the fact that they actually embezzled company funds, right? The aesthetic of suffering doesn't equal moral innocence.
That is a flawless modern translation. Do not let the eloquence of the apology or the beauty of the poetry blind you to the stark reality of the transgression.
As we step back from the specifics of English politics, we can find incredible comparative insight by connecting Richard's ultimate fate to broader, universal human concerns. Because ultimately, this narrative isn't just about who gets to wear a piece of metal on their head in the 14th century.
No, it is a profound meditation on the relentless march of time, the illusion of control, and the terrifying inevitability of being replaced.
To fully grasp that universal theme, we have to look at Richard in Act 5, after he's been deposed and locked away in a dark dungeon at Pomfret Castle.
He is completely isolated from the world. No flatterers, no court, no mirror. And in that absolute isolation, he finally begins to understand the illusion of control.
He describes his brain and his soul generating a generation of still-breathing thoughts, and notes how these internal thoughts constantly conflict with one another, just like the ambitious nobles in his former kingdom.
He is finally exploring the complex, treacherous internal landscape of his own psychology, rather than obsessing over the external landscape of his lost kingdom.
And it's in that desolate prison that we get one of the most heartbreaking scenes in all of Shakespeare. A poor groom of the stable, a man who used to serve Richard, manages to visit him in the dungeon.
The groom reveals that on Coronation Day, Bowling Brook rode through the streets of London on Richard's favorite horse, Roan Barbary.
Richard is desperate for details. He asks, "Rode he on Barbary? Tell me, gentle friend, how went he under him?" And the groom replies that the horse stepped so proudly, it was as if he disdained the ground.
Richard's initial reaction is pure devastation. He expects the universe to share his grief. He cries out, "That jade hath eat bread from my royal hand. Would he not stumble? Would he not fall down, since pride must have a fall, and break the neck of that proud man that did usurp his back?"
But then, in a moment of unprecedented psychological maturity, Richard catches himself. He stops the self-pity.
He says, "Forgiveness, horse. Why do I rail on thee, since thou, created to be awed by man, wast born to bear?"
It is a stunning realization of a core Stoic truth. Richard finally understands that external things, whether they're horses, grand castles, bank accounts, or royal titles, they owe us absolutely zero loyalty.
They have no memory of our greatness. They simply adapt to whoever holds the reins in the present moment. They owe us zero loyalty.
That realization connects deeply to a haunting analogy delivered earlier in the play by the Duke of York, doesn't it?
Yes, York is describing to his Duchess the brutal reality of how the crowds reacted when Bowling Brook and Richard rode into London together. He uses the metaphor of the theater to describe the fickleness of public attention.
York says, "As in a theater, the eyes of men, after a well-graced actor leaves the stage, are idly bent on him that enters next, thinking his prattle to be tedious. Even so, or with much more contempt, men's eyes did scowl on gentle Richard."
It touches on the deepest, most universal fear of obsolescence. It is the terror of being forgotten by the crowd the very second you are no longer standing center stage. The audience doesn't care about your past performances. They only care about who is walking into the spotlight right now.
York is basically describing our modern social media feeds, isn't he? We are all just well-graced actors desperately trying to hold the stage for our 15 seconds of fame. And then the algorithm, the eyes of men, idly bends to the person who enters next.
The crowd always moves on. It doesn't matter if you were the divinely anointed king of England or the CEO of a tech unicorn, the theater always needs a new actor, and the crowd's gaze is entirely merciless.
The gaze of the world is merciless.
Which brings us to one final thread I want to leave the listener to pull on. Consider the ultimate beautiful paradox of Richard's journey. Throughout the entire play, when he is draped in majesty, surrounded by thousands of armed men, and blinded by the holy oil of his title, he is entirely ignorant of himself and the mechanics of the world.
Totally blind.
But it is only when he is locked in a dark dungeon at Pomfret, stripped of every single external identifier, reduced to a legal nothing, that he finally begins to truly understand the architecture of his own mind. The paradox is this. Sometimes, it is only in the absolute devastating loss of our constructed identity that our true self is finally met.
That's the heart of this section. This is wisdom for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.